Hi, this is Mark from eReplacementParts.com. This time of year we get a lot of questions about how do I replace the fuel lines on my grass string trimmer, and we're going to show you how to do that today. The first thing we need to do is some disassembly to get into the gas lines themselves. Okay. With the cover off, now we have access to the carburetor and the rear carburetor mount plate, or sometimes it might be called a choke plate. In this case it just holds the primer bulb and has some openings that the fuel lines go through to get to the gas tank. So the next step is to remove the carburetor, and now the carburetor is loose. Right here is my throttle cable, and I'm just going to tip the carburetor up and remove that throttle cable like that. Now we need to remove this rear plate. And again, that's held on with some more torque screws. There we are. On my particular trimmer, this whole assembly is going to come off as one piece. I'll have the carburetor, the rear mounting plate, and the fuel tank all as one piece. I do need to thread the throttle cable through an opening on that plate. There we are. And that all comes off now. The next thing I want to do before I remove all my fuel lines is to take note of the positions, so when I go to put everything back together, I'll know where the fuel lines go. And we'll take note of that now. So first I'm going to look at the fuel lines and figure out what the routing is. Looks like this line here attaches to the fuel filter itself. So this is my incoming fuel line. There's also a small little inline connector or a splice in that line. So that comes out, passes through the wall of this back plate, and goes to the bottom of the filter. So on my diagram here I've drawn, I'll make note of that. Now I've got a second line, comes out at the top of the carburetor, passes back through the wall of this back plate, and goes into, looks like it's the short end of the primer bulb. So I'll put that on my diagram. I've already labeled that that's the short end of the primer. And then off the long side of the primer, this line is the return line or the overflow line, and that goes back into the tank here. And we'll just note that. And now when we go to reassemble, we know where everything goes. I found the easiest way to remove the fuel lines from the carburetor and all of the other fittings is to just simply take a flat-bladed screwdriver, place it against the edge of the fuel line, and then you can just kind of push the blade away and it'll pull the line right off the fitting. So I'm just going to do that to all of the fittings now, removing all of the old fuel lines. And that's it. Now we have all of our old fuel lines removed. To reassemble the new lines, I'm going to start with the line with the fuel filter. This is probably the trickiest line. What we need to do here is fish this in through the tank, catch the end of the line on the hole through the tank, and then pull it through. So we'll see how we do here. Oh, and we got it. So pull the line through. You want to make sure you have the fuel filter sitting flush with the bottom of the tank. So if my hand here were the tank, I want it right down perfectly flush against the tank when it's installed. Okay, with the fuel filter assembly reinstalled into the tank, now we have this little retaining ring or clip that we need to slide over the fuel line. This will basically clamp the fuel filter against the tank. This just slides on, and then I've got my finger in the tank. I'm pressing down on the fuel filter, and at the same time I'm going to take a pair of needle nose pliers, just kind of put them around the line. I'm not grasping the line. What I'm really doing is just pushing down on this ring. And I'll push that tight against the tank. Just a little more. Just like that. And now that fuel filter is clamped in place, and we're not going to get any fuel leaking out of the tank. Okay, now going to replace the primer bulb. The old primer bulb just snaps out, has some little spring tabs you press, just like that. And now we'll just snap in the new primer bulb, just like that. Okay, now we can start putting some more of the lines on. It looks like our return line, according to the diagram I drew, goes from the long end of the primer assembly back to the fuel tank. And I'm actually going to put the return line into the fuel tank first. We'll just slide about 3/4 or an inch of line back up into the tank. About like that will work fine. Now we can go ahead and put this backing plate back into place, or basically just thread the lines through it. So the first one I need to thread through is the feed line. Just like that. That goes to the bottom of the carburetor. Then we have the primer line. Goes from the short tube of the primer through the top hole in the backing plate, and that'll get attached to the carburetor in just a moment. Now back to that return line. That goes on, like I said, the long end of the primer, and we're just going to cut that to length. I'm going to set this up on the tank, how it'll be installed, and looks like we can cut off about 3/4 of an inch of that line to make it fit, just like that. And we'll install that one to the long end of the primer. Just like that. Now all we have left to do is to hook up the carburetor itself. Again, my feed line attaches to the bottom of the carburetor. So just press that line on. And the return line to the top of the carburetor. And that basically covers the installation of the new fuel lines. Now all we need to do is reassemble it. We'll do that next. Now to begin our reassembly, we'll take the fuel tank, backplate, and carburetor assembly with all of our new fuel lines and mount it back to the trimmer. The first thing I need to do here is take that throttle cable and thread it back through the hole on the backplate, just like that. Now we'll go ahead and reattach the throttle cable to the carburetor, just like that. Now we can take the screws that hold the back plate in place and reattach those. Very simple. And 4 screws hold this in place. And that's all there is to it. I hope this video has helped you to install new fuel lines on your string trimmer.